example, Camp London's Finsbury Park Mosque Imam Abu Hamza, an outspoken and jeering advocate of terror, be arrested for outlawed propaganda of terror. For many years, Abu Hamza has openly voiced his support for bombing embassies and robbing banks. He approved of the Moscow apartment building bombings and held bin Laden in the September 11th terror attacks. He was arrested only when the United States had assumed the responsibility for his arrest. Are accusations of religious discrimination that scary? The case of depriving him of citizenship is hopelessly stuck in the courts, and human rights activists are on alert to prevent possible violation of Abu Hamza's rights. Finally, the United States has brought a specific charge of terrorism against him and demanded his extradition, pledging not to execute the man. The story is far from being over. The very fact that England failed to find grounds for Hamza's arrest makes it clear who really rules Europe. Extremist Italian Red Brigades enjoy the protection of a left-wing liberal Europe too. In 1985, François Mitterrand offered asylum to the left radicals, claiming that since the Red Brigade's members had denounced violence and been integrated into the French society, they could stay in France. Hundreds of Red Brigadiers have lived there ever since. The Italian authorities have demanded their extradition, but France regards such demands as persecution on political grounds. The most famous case is that of Cesar Battisti, a detective story writer and murderer of 4 people. He first went to Mexico, then understood that hiding did not make much sense since he could enjoy his life in France, where human rights watchers would cherish him. The Human Rights Watchers blacklist is surprisingly similar to that of Muslim terrorists, such as Abu Hamza, for example. He addressed the press shortly after the crash of the Columbia shuttle, saying that the catastrophe struck the evil trinity because it contained Americans, an Israeli man, and a woman from India. Are the forecasts of a disastrous clash of civilizations and the impossibility to find a common language exaggerated? The Europeans, represented by their left-wing elite, have long been speaking the same language with the most extreme Muslims. Or would you say that the European mass media and the major newsmaker Saddam Hussein failed to understand each other? Hussein kept children's corpses in the refrigerator specifically for TV crews to present them again and again in front of TV cameras as victims of barbaric NATO bombings. The journalists took the hint and made a sensation out of each of these presentations. Much has been written and said about the miraculous effects of the mass media, about the mass media shaping the contemporary world, about any event being inexistent if not shown on TV. We don't know how things would have developed in the Middle East hadn't there been TV crews, say on the west bank of the Jordan River, but it sure would have been a different war. The West Bank TV stars are well familiar with the habits and soft spots of the West. They know that the word victim has a magic effect on European minds, but the sight of a corpse and the relatives' tears make the Europeans particularly nervous. The reaction is quite natural, especially if one keeps in mind that Europe last saw a mass murder 50 years ago. Public opinion, sensitive to the horrors of war, can be easily manipulated, and any amount of blood shown on TV provokes the strongest emotions. The Europeans can inflict sorrow, but they can't look at it. And really, who can be at ease while watching murder, especially if it's a close-up killing? Take note that the video-recorded execution of an American hostage, placed by the terrorists on the internet, shows the hostage pleading for an end to the aggression against Iraq. His speech alternating with pictures of dead and wounded Iraqi children. This is a standard trick of criminals, all blows below the belt.
We need to leave this country alone. We need to stop this occupation.
And there is no doubt that an international meeting will again include a close examination of the pictures of suffering kids. The tactics called "Don't Dare Tread on the Heels of the Poor and the Miserable" always bring results. These people know how to stir the Europeans' emotions. When Israel eliminated Hamas leader Sheikh Yassin, representatives of the Muslim community immediately uttered the words that were magic for the European ear. The Israelis have murdered an old and disabled man. True, Sheikh Yassin was disabled, and no doubt he was old. But in this case, his age and physical abilities are of little importance. What is relevant is that he was the leader of a terrorist organization and masterminded 425 acts of terror over the previous 3 years. Europe has always sided with the weak and deprived, but only the mass media makes a victim a victim. For many years, the Albanians and the Serbs had been killing each other. The Albanians as a small and freedom-loving people, and the Serbs as oppressors and murderers of children. If we watch TV programs of that time, we will see that NATO bombings were preceded by around-the-clock propaganda bombardment. The Albanian blood turned out to be redder than that of the Serbs, and obviously more telegenic, because Albanian victims were always in the spotlight. As soon as the public opinion had been prepared, a humanitarian intervention became an absolute necessity. And then Europe lightheartedly allowed the bombings of Yugoslavia. Remarkably, lack of UN sanction was not a problem. In its disputes with America, Europe usually sticks to the point that only the Security Council can sanction a war, but Europe only seems to be inconsistent. There is a hidden logic in the inconsistency. What is not allowed the U.S. and Israel is allowed to everybody else. There are no protests outside North Korean embassies. The Green ignored Hussein dumping crude oil in the Persian Gulf. And why were there no bursts of indignation against the internal policy of Belarus, with the country's opposition gone to nobody knows where? Human rights activists seem reluctant to go to the embassies of Rwanda, Nigeria, or other countries where millions of people die as a result of genocide. Augusto Pinochet was not a great humanist. More than 2,200 people perished in Chile under his rule. At the age of 83, he found himself in court for that. The Spanish prosecutor had demanded an international arrest warrant, and it was immediately issued. Shortly after that, the Spanish court demanded an international warrant for the arrest of the hero of the European liberals, Fidel Castro. Spaniards perished in Cuba too. The victims of the Castro regime by far outnumbered those in Chile. 17,000 Cubans were shot by order of Fidel, and thousands died trying to escape from the country of victorious socialism. The demand for arrest was decidedly rejected. The reason is that Pinochet is a dictator, and what is Fidel? Correct, an outstanding revolutionary leader. For Europe, there are friendly and alien dictators. The aliens seem to be somewhat kinder. Oh yes, we almost forgot. Apart from racism, colonialism, hunger, wars, and other evils of this world, the left-wing liberals also hate the wall. Yes, the security wall being built by Israel. The Hague Tribunal, the EU, and human rights organizations are united in their bitter condemnation of Israel and its wall. Europe has accused Israel of apartheid with respect to the Palestinians, and the leadership of the EU stated that Israel shows total disregard for human lives. But why is the wall so insulting to the humanitarians' feelings? Especially if one remembers that those feelings were not in the least hurt by the events in North Korea, or the murders of the opposition in Belarus, or the terror attacks in Israel. These acts of terror, by the way, were supported by 75 to 90% of the Palestinians, according to various polls. The wall doesn't kill anyone. The only threat to the Palestinians is a queue at the checkpoints. It may be inconvenient, but it's not lethal. And where there was a wall built, the number of terrorist attacks have decreased by 90%. What evil will Europe face earlier? An absorption by the Muslim population or terror attacks in its cities? Is it ready to respond? Will it be able to demand of itself what it demands of others? Europe has become soft, and no wonder. The present-day Europeans and their fathers die natural deaths in comfortable beds, full of dignity, and believing that all peoples will one day become civilized and accept Western democracy. The international laws on conduct of war have evidently become outdated, and in effect only for those who don't yet have suicide bombers blowing themselves up nearby. The rules of war were written at the time when combatants had more or less similar principles, and wars were conducted between countries and their armies. People back at that time could afford to write down in the Geneva Convention that everyone who wasn't in a military uniform and didn't display his arms was not a combatant and should be protected against the war. Just like children under 15, and all women and children should be protected. Nowadays, these people are proactively engaged in military actions, although they wear no uniforms. you can be confronted by an 11-year-old with a grenade launcher or an explosives belt. If not in broad daylight, then at night. Isn't it high time to change the war laws?
Allahu Akbar!
What will the Europeans say when bombs explode in the neighboring cafe or the nearest subway station? How will they change their attitudes, and will they at all? Several scenarios are possible. They will convert into Islam, change their clothes, and start speaking other languages. Or, the second scenario, they will perish, believing in the social utopia until the last moment. Or the third, they will muster some courage and face the reality.